Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Diane Walker. I'm immensely delighted that you are here with us for our virtual conversation, An American Journey, A Legacy of Freedom and Slavery with author, writer, journalist Gayle Jessup White. Our program is sponsored by Pasadena Public Library, Hastings Branch Associates. We're going to wait just one more minute and then we're going to get started. Again, my name is Diane Walker and I am the senior librarian at Hastings Branch. I also have with me today librarian Stephanie Doff, library technician Kevin Collins assisting with the program. I'm so grateful to have them on my team, and I have a very special virtual librarian also helping with the videotaping of Gayle's presentation. So we're going to wait one more minute, and then we're going to start with the Zoom housekeeping rules. Okay, there we go. Okay, please keep yourselves muted during the program. If you need assistance doing this, Kevin will help you. He will be checking the waiting room and allowing people to enter. Please use the chat box to ask questions, and Gayle will answer the questions during a Q&A session immediately following her talk. So you want to look for that to find that so that you can put your questions in once she starts talking. Okay. Monticello, once the home of Thomas Jefferson and 400 enslaved men, women, and children, is a testament to America's legacy of freedom and slavery. Gayle Jessup White, a descendant of Jefferson and two of the families he enslaved, discusses her journey, tracing her family's oral tradition, connecting her to Jefferson. A memoir about her lifelong journey will be published by HarperCollins Armistead Press in the fall of 2021. That's this year. Gayle is also Monticello's first public relation and community engagement officer, a role which she took after spending decades tracing her family's oral tradition and Jefferson's connection. She has traveled around the country with Monticello's traveling exhibition, Paradox of Liberty, Slavery at Jefferson Monticello, lecturing and participating on panels at school, churches, businesses, museums, Smithsonian, African American Museum of History and Culture, Detroit Charles Wright Museum, and today Gayle can add Pasadena Public Library to her illustrious list. A former award-winning TV reporter and anchor, Gayle began her journalism career at New York Times, where she interned in the Washington Bureau. She left the Times for Northwestern University, earning a Master's of Science in Journalism. She spent several years as a TV reporter and anchor before becoming a public television producer and show host at her undergraduate alma mater, Howard University. A proud Washingtonian, Gayle currently lives in Richmond, Virginia with her husband, writer Jack E. White Jr., and a blended family of 5 children and 7 beautiful granddaughters. It is my honor to present Gayle Jessup White. Thank you.
Diane, thank you so much. Wow, that was quite an introduction. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate all of you being here this evening. And I'm so jealous, I must add, because I'm in Richmond, Virginia, where it's dark, as you can see behind me. It's cold and it's rainy. And I love LA. It's one of my favorite places. In fact, my sister, Dr. Patricia Jessup Woodland, who's also responsible for my being here with you today, is in LA, and I'm a frequent guest of hers. And I should also add, before we continue, that she has an exhibition there called We the People at Pasadena Library. So I hope that you'll have a chance to go there and see it, even in the age of COVID, as I know that all protections are in place. So thank you so much, Diane. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm very thrilled. And we have a lot of ground to cover this evening, so we're going to get started. It's an honor to be here with you. As I said, we have a story this evening that I consider a very important American story because it's one of resistance, resilience, and recovery. And we're going to begin hundreds of years ago, right here in Virginia, where more than 400 years after the first enslaved Americans were brought to the colony of Virginia, 234 years after the Declaration of Independence birthed a new nation, And 155 years after the Civil War freed 4 million enslaved men, women, and children, the United States of America continues to grapple with its original sin, and that's slavery. The past 12 months, we have been eyewitness to this legacy. As Black Americans have died disproportionately of COVID-19 or lost jobs or homes, and as we have seen with graphic images, they've lost lives. 21 years into the 21st century, Black people are still demanding equal rights, equal treatment, equal citizenship. There's a lot of support among many Americans for our quest for equal rights, and that quest has been with us since the beginning of this country. Monticello is at the epicenter for uncomfortable conversations about race in America. Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration, owned more than 607 people throughout his long life. He lived 83 years. 400 of those people were enslaved in Monticello. Jefferson, most people don't know, had many plantations. 200 were enslaved on one of his many other plantations. And 4 generations of my family were among the people that he enslaved. And Jefferson is also my 5 times great-grandfather. So our history is very complex, very entangled, very overlapping, and not unique in America. What makes us unique is our connection to Jefferson because of the copious notes he kept, the knowledge that's made available to us, so we're able to access information about our family. However, I must say, I did not know this about my family when I was a child growing up in Washington, D.C. But once I found out, I made it my life's mission to discover my family's roots. And we're going to talk about some of that this evening. And here's our opening slide. And that is the view that you're seeing now is of Monticello. It's an opening montage where you'll see Jefferson, you'll see the famous dome, which is on the west lawn. And you see us dancing there. That's my son there making those sharp moves in the black shirt, because Monticello has become a welcoming place for people who own it as our heritage. It is our heritage. And we will go to the next slide. And I want to thank the staff there, specifically Stephanie Dahl, for helping with this slide presentation. Thank you. This is on the West Lawn. On June 16th, 2018, some 300 people gathered at Monticello for a family reunion unlike any in modern history. They'd come to honor their ancestors, the men, women, and children who had been enslaved at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and to celebrate 25 years of the Getting Word Oral History Project, the initiative that helped many of them find their forgotten forebears. 300 people came to Monticello to reclaim what had been lost for decades, and that's their own family history. And as I said earlier, it's also my family history. Now, I stood for this family photograph with my son, my nieces, and scores of cousins, many of whom I was meeting for the first time. But behind the smiles, as we basked in the moment, and it was a glorious day, was the knowledge of a painful history, that our ancestors had been sold on the very ground where we stood. And we can go to the next slide. On a cold day in January 1827, more than 100 human beings, possibly shivering from fear as well as the cold, stood on the West Lawn awaiting their fate. 6 months earlier, their future seemed secure. But when their owner, Thomas Jefferson, third president, owner of human beings, died on July 4th, 1826, all that changed. Now, the people that he called his family, he called the enslaved his family, were going to be sold to the highest bidder. My great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Hemings, was among those unfortunate souls. The slide you see now is of my family. I didn't know any of this when I was growing up in Washington, D.C. Our family of 7 was comfortably middle class. We happily took advantage of all that the city had to offer. We went to museums, the Smithsonian, the National Gallery of Art, all free. That's one of the great things about Washington, D.C. We didn't know these things. But perhaps visiting those beautiful sites, the monument, the White House, Mount Vernon, gave me this love of history, especially presidential history. And interestingly, Thomas Jefferson was my favorite president. And he was my favorite president because he wrote the Declaration, which I thought was a marvelous document, even as a young person. Back then, and it was a lot of years ago, we weren't taught that Jefferson was a slaveholder. We weren't told the truth of our heritage, of our American history, of our founders. We were told that George Washington always told the truth. I could tell you stories, I don't want to digress from the script because we'll be here all night, about some of the things that George Washington did. But nonetheless, all those years ago, when I was a little girl, and I'm a little baby in my dad's arms, and I'm the youngest in the family. All those years ago, Thomas Jefferson was a hero for me. So you can imagine how curious I was when I overheard a conversation between my dad and my older sister Janice claiming that we were Jefferson descendants. Thank you for going to the next slide. I was 13 years old then. You can see us in this photograph. My sister Janice was 32. She's almost 20 years older than I. And I was enthralled by her. I thought she was the most glamorous creature I'd ever seen. And she and her husband, Wallace Terry, had just returned from 2 years in Asia, where he was covering the Vietnam War for Time magazine. And here's the story I heard her tell Dad, that she and Wally were guests of honor at Saigon's American embassy. And they had this interesting conversation. Everyone at the dinner table was white, aside from my sister and her husband. And this is about in the late 1960s. And they were talking about their heritage, their background. And I heard Janice telling Daddy that people were talking about themselves as if they were royalty, that they had descended from this person, descended by that person. It was all very grand. Now, my sister Janice is a small R Republican and a small D Democrat, and she was very offended by this conversation. Americans had shed blood, she said, to free themselves of monarchy. So she decided to teach everyone at that table a lesson. And she was going to outdo all of them. Now, as I mentioned, my sister Janice is very glamorous, very dramatic. I should add that as well. So she rose to her greatest height. And remember, this is in the 1960s. So this kind of conversation that you're about to hear was quite taboo. She says, I'm a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. Well, my sister said the room went dead silent, aside from the sound of the silver touching the dinnerware, the china. But she made her point. She let that group know, that all-white group, bragging about their own ancestry, that she was descended from one of the most famous individuals in history, not just American history, but world history. Now, I had never heard this in my entire 13 years that we were descended from Thomas Jefferson. So of course I was very, very curious about it, intrigued by it. And I went to Dad, and we can go to the next slide if you would, please. And this is our family. I love this photograph. I went to Daddy and I asked him about it. And Dad was quite noncommittal. He said simply, that's what they say. And that was it. But in time, even then I was kind of a budding journalist. This was around the time of Watergate. So I was really interested in prodding, pushing, wanting to know more, probing. So I kind of pushed my dad a little bit and eventually found out that it was a story that was passed down from his mother's half sister. Her name was Aunt Peachy. I never knew Aunt Peachy. She died around the same time I was born. And my sister Pat, who's in this picture, she's the only one wearing black, my sister, the artist. She told me that Aunt Peachy was the sweetest person she'd ever known. I never knew Aunt Peachy. I only knew what my family told me. And part of what they told me about her was that she couldn't read, she couldn't write, she couldn't even sign her own name, but she knew this one thing, which she passed down to anyone who would listen, and was mostly Janice. You're descended from Thomas Jefferson. Now, Aunt Peachy was a half aunt. she would always say, "You're descended from Thomas Jefferson. I'm not." So it's based on that single thread of oral history that came down from a half aunt. It's an odd thing to say, but a half aunt who could neither read, write, or even spell her own name or write her own name, who was convinced, and she was a domestic and sweet and kind and a little superstitious, but she was convinced that we were descendants of Thomas Jefferson. Janice believed her, and I believed Janice. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. I had my doubts. I was a little skeptical, quite naturally. We're a Black family growing up in Washington, D.C. However, I should say about my dad, who was a Black man who could have passed for white. He was 6'2". He had a freckled face. As a young man, he had red hair. And he actually had a very interesting nose that had, I don't have it, I thank my mother for that. But he had an interesting nose that had a little hump there in the bridge. It turns out it's the Jeffersonian nose. This is my picture of my dad and me from my graduation from Howard University. Now, Dad and I talked about everything. Dad and I were quite close. We talked about politics, religion, football, but we never talked about our family's ties to Jefferson or about his family for that matter, especially about his mother. And there was a reason for that. And I'll tell you that as we continue this evening. We can go to the next slide. This is my father's mother. This is Aunt Peachy's half-sister. My father's mother's name was Eva Robinson Taylor. She had two names, Dad always said, Robinson and Taylor, her maiden names. But he never explained why. Actually, he didn't know why. And he didn't because she died when he was just 5 years old. Dad would say, with as little emotion as possible, he wasn't a demonstrative man. He was a stoic man, very strong person, but very loving and very protective. And he would tell me that he couldn't remember his mother's face or even the sound of her voice. He wasn't sure what her name was, Robinson or Taylor, that's all he knew. And the tragedy continues because not only did he lose his mother when he was 5 years old, he lost all 5 of his sisters. Their names were Louise and Thelma. That's really true, Louise and Thelma, Artie, Carrie, and Helena. And they were all victims of tuberculosis. Only Dad's father and brother survived. And we can go to the next slide and I'll show you pictures. There's Louise and Thelma. And they were the oldest of the two girls, and they died when they were 16 and 17. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see Artie and Carrie. Carrie's the one with the big bow. Carrie died when she was 16 years old. Actually, it was the day after her 16th birthday. Daddy remembered her, but he didn't remember any of his other sisters, just Carrie. This is a very sad story and had a great impact, on me when he told me these stories because I loved my dad so much and I could tell that he was suffering, that he was in pain, and I didn't want him to be in pain. So I always thought that if I could uncover my father's past, that would help him heal and that it would help me heal. So I kept pushing him. And I finally got him to tell me that his mother was from Charlottesville. So we can go to the next slide. And in case you need to be reminded, Thomas Jefferson was from Charlottesville. This is a picture of my dad and my uncle, his brother, when they were much, much older, senior citizens, the last survivors of that young Jessup family. I went to visit Uncle Eugene shortly before he died because I wanted to ask him what he knew of our family. And Uncle Eugene told me the most remarkable things about my grandmother. He was the older of the two boys, and so he remembered a lot more than Dad did. He told me that his mother, Eva Robinson Taylor, was 6 feet tall. Unusual, quite, even today, to find a woman that tall. That she sang and that she played the piano, and that she was very happy. And Uncle Eugene remembers that my grandfather called her his angel, his angel. Now, Uncle Eugene also gave me this Bible. And this Bible is remarkable. It's my most treasured possession, one of them. This Bible is engraved with the initials DT and the date 1823. Now, I didn't get it at the time. I just didn't have the training. I wasn't thinking. I was so hung up on Thomas Jefferson that it didn't hit me that the T might have indicated Taylor. And of course, I had no idea what Taylor meant. But this Bible with these initials DT on it became significant as I continued with my journey in trying to uncover my family's history. And Uncle Eugene also gave me the family pictures, the ones we saw earlier of the young Jessup girls, the ones who died from tuberculosis, and of the picture you're about to see. And thank you. This is a picture of a woman we believe was named Lucy, and we can only guess. This woman was my grandmother's sister. She was my great aunt. And the reason we can only guess is because she married wealth and passed into white society. And you can look at her head, look at her outfit, look at her confidence. She moved with wealth in the white society. And she stayed with our family. When I say she stayed with our family, she would visit. But when my grandmother died, she asked to take the 3 surviving children with her. Uncle Eugene, my dad, and Carrie, the one who died the day after her 16th birthday. And she threatened my grandfather. She said, if you don't let me take the surviving children with me to New York and educate them and care for them, which kind of tells us that they might have passed into white society as well. She said she wouldn't return if he wouldn't let her take the children. And my grandfather, who was of course heartbroken, refused. And this woman never came back. She disappeared. She disappeared until the 1960s, when my parents got a call from someone in New York looking for a relative of an ailing woman. The person on the other end of the line told them that they were taking advantage of her and stealing from her, that she was quite wealthy. My parents asked, using the vernacular of the time, if the person they were taking advantage of, the ailing woman, was white or Negro. And they were told she was white. So my parents said, she can't be related to us then because we're Negro. Hung up the phone. All that history, my inheritance, all that gone like that. But you know what was really lost? What was really lost? Poor Lucy. She gave up her family. She lost her family. It happens to so many people. It has happened to many people who made that choice. That's what racism has done. It's injured, damaged, destroyed families. So I'm sorry for Lucy. I don't think we'll ever find out exactly what happened to her, but we do have this picture. This is a really complex story, and I understand that it's easy to get lost in the entanglement of it, and there's so much more to it, which is why I've written a book about it, and we can talk about that in a minute. But what I want to show you right now is this family tree, which shows you, I'm trying to get it up on my screen so I can see the whole thing. Here we are, which kind of shows you the relationships that I started uncovering. As I continued my research, started working with the people at Monticello And it's a long story. That's another really quite remarkable story how I ended up at Monticello. I was able to find out exactly how I was related to Thomas Jefferson. As it turns out, my great grandmother, whose name was Rachel Robinson, had a relationship with Thomas Jefferson's great great grandson. And do you know what his name was? It was Moncure Robinson Taylor. So, after so many years of searching, with the help of Monticello's researchers and all that documentation and all those records that Thomas Jefferson kept, and all the endless interest that people have had in Jefferson for 200 years, I was able to find the connection. I was able to find out why my grandmother had two names, Robinson and Taylor. On sacred records, she used the name Taylor. On civic records, she used the name Robinson. Taylor was directly tied to her father, whose name was Moncure Robinson Taylor, a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson's. So I'm just going to leave this up for a minute so we can get an idea of this complex history. So my dad's Cedric Jessup, my mom is Teresa Jessup. That's her family, her parents here, Delafosse Green, Christine Hunt. My grandparents were Arthur Jessup, my grandmother, Eva Robinson Taylor Jessup. She, I'll go on, was the daughter of Rachel Robinson, who had a relationship, they did not marry, with a Moncure Robinson Taylor. He was the Jefferson descendant. So let's go look at that side. Martha Randolph, oh no, please, no, I'm sorry. Go back to the other slide, please. My reference was to this side of the family, sorry. Martha Randolph was the great-granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson. She married a cousin, John Charles Randolph Taylor, because that's what they did, cousins marry cousins. She was the daughter of Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who was the favorite grandson of Thomas Jefferson. He married Jane Hollins Nicholas. And then we go back down another generation. Martha Jefferson, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales, marries Thomas Mann Randolph, also a cousin. And then we go all the way down to the bottom here, and we see Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales. So I am descended from Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales, which puts us in a different relationship to the family than those descendants of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. But guess what? I'm also descended from the Hemings family, because let's go back up and look at Rachel Robinson back at the top of our graphic here. Rachel Robinson, and I apologize, it's complex, it's hard to keep up, but this helps. Rachel Robinson was the daughter of Edmund Robinson and Sally Hemings. That's not the famous Sally Hemings, but that is the niece of the famous Sally Hemings. If you recall, I said that my 3 times great-grandfather, Peter Hemings, was sold in 1827, 6 months after Jefferson died. Well, Peter Hemings was the famous Sally Hemings' brother. And for those who don't know, Sally Hemings was the enslaved woman who had 6 children with Thomas Jefferson, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. So it's a complex story. We can go to the next slide. Please, thank you. This slide shows us the Hemings family. So if we go to the top, once again, we see Cedric and Teresa, we see Arthur and Eva, we see Rachel, my great-grandmother, and Moncure Robinson Taylor, the Jefferson descendant, my great-grandfather. We see Edmund and Sally, Edmund Robinson and Sally Hemings. I call her the other Sally Hemings. She was the daughter of Peter and Betsy. And beneath them, that long line, you see all the children, many of the siblings of Sally Hemings. The reason that they're here is because if you go down to the bottom, you'll see John Wales and Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings was half African and half European. She had children with John Wales, who was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law and a slave trader. And then at the very bottom, we see that Elizabeth Hemings was the daughter of Captain Hemings and an African woman. We believe her name was Parthenia. It's an interesting story with Elizabeth Hemings. She was, I should say this, Captain Hemings at first owned Parthenia, but Parthenia was sold to a family in America. But Parthenia was pregnant and he wanted to keep the child. But because Parthenia was owned by this American family, at this point it wasn't John Wales, but again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but because she was owned by an American family, they wanted to know what the child was going to look like. That's amalgamation is how they described a human being. They wanted to see what this amalgamated child was going to look like. So Captain Hemings couldn't keep his child. She had to go with Parthenia, and Parthenia had to go with her owners. And that's how Elizabeth Hemings ended up with this family, the family of John Wales. And I'm happy to answer your questions if you have any regarding this very complicated story. And I would like to add here too, that again, I said earlier that these relationships were common practice, particularly in the southern part of the United States. And in Jefferson's household, and in Jefferson's lineage, not his household, but his lineage, there were several generations of relationships like this with the enslaved and the enslaved. Let's just stop here and look at John Wales and Elizabeth Hemings. John Wales, as I said, was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. He had a relationship with Elizabeth Hemings, and they had several children, among them my great-great-great-grandfather and Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, and he didn't start this relationship until after his wife died. Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson have a relationship, and they have several children. Thomas Jefferson's son-in-law, go down another generation, also has a relationship with a Hemings child, and they have children. And then you go down another generation to Thomas Jefferson's great-great-grandson, who was my great-grandfather, and he has a relationship with a Hemings family member. So there are 4 generations of people related to Thomas Jefferson in some capacity or another, and Hemings family members having relationships. That's how complex and how close these people were to each other. We can go to the next slide, please. So Diane mentioned our traveling exhibition, Paradox of Liberty, Slave with Jefferson's Monticello. It is a phenomenal exhibition. And the slide you see here mentions Sally Hemings as an individual, as a human being, and all that she was. She was an enslaved woman, yes, but she was a seamstress and a world traveler and a sister, negotiator, liberator. She was all those things. And that's what happens in this exhibition. There are 300 artifacts in this exhibition, 300 objects that help us understand that the enslaved were human beings. They weren't this monolith or this image that has been conveyed through movies such as Gone with the Wind. They were people. They were people with longing and people with feelings and people with joys and people with hopes. They were happy, they were sad. They had ambition. They were people. And that's what this exhibition tells us. And we can go to the next slide, please. The exhibition was last here in Richmond, Virginia, at the Black History Museum here. And it traveled around the country until COVID, and we had to shut down our travels. However, the great news is that it's gone virtual. So soon, no matter where you are, just as we are talking tonight, 3,000 miles separating us, no matter where you are, you will be able to see this exhibition virtually. And I will be happy to share more information about that with Diane, who can share with you. It is a fabulous exhibition. And once it's available, I encourage all of you to experience it virtually. And if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. In this exhibition, you'll see so many of the tools and instruments that the enslaved used, including a toothbrush, my absolute favorite object of all the things, all the 300 artifacts. I love the toothbrush because to me, there's nothing more humanizing than an everyday instrument that we all use, a toothbrush. It's those kinds of things you'll be able to see: marbles, combs, uh, bottles, tools, just so much that allows us to see the enslaved for who they were and how, as much as we can, they saw themselves, the skills that they had, the talents that they had. All that comes through in this exhibition. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Found near the ruins of or what was left of a cabin where Elizabeth Hemings, who was my 4 times great grandmother, lived, was china, such as what we're seeing now. Enslaved people wanted nice things. Sometimes they had extra jobs when they weren't working for their owner, which was sun up to sundown. They managed to find time to make a little extra money. And when they did have a little extra money, they would purchase lovely items such as this china that you're seeing. So again, I keep using the word humanizing, but that's what it does. So that's part of what you'll see, what's left, that china. Then the next slide, please. Now this is a reimagined dress of what Sally Hemings would have worn when she was a servant in Paris. Just to give you a quick background, when Sally Hemings was, let me go back a little further. Thomas Jefferson became minister to Paris, and he was there for a couple of years when he heard that one of his little girls had died. He took his oldest daughter, Martha, to Europe with him, to France, where he was minister, but he didn't take his other 2 children. One of them died. So when that happened, he wanted to have his daughter, Maria, brought to Europe, to France, to be with him and to be with Martha. The person who escorted her was 14-year-old Sally Hemings. And when she was in Paris, she was a lady's maid to Mariah and to Martha. And as a lady's maid, she would have worn a garment such as this because she would have gone everywhere with them. She would have gone to the opera. She would have gone to the theater. She would have gone to the many parties. He's minister to France, so he would have been invited to the most elegant of events. And she would have worn a dress such as this. What's interesting in this dress is that it's very pretty. It's very fine fabric. She had to be presentable. She had to be pretty when she went out with her 2 charges. But this dress is going to be a little shorter than similar, but a little shorter than what her charges would have worn, and not as lacy. It would have been shorter because she had to be mobile. She was a servant, so she had to be able to get about very easily. And it would have been not had as much lace, of course, in part for some of the same reasons. You wouldn't have a lot of lace getting in the way. And because she wasn't a lady, so she could be pretty and presentable, but not as. That's what's so demoralizing, isn't it? Not as, always a little less than. If we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So part of what we do at Monticello is celebrate the descendants of the enslaved and the enslaved in their many accomplishments. And the descendants of the enslaved have done remarkable things. And what you're seeing before you are pictures of remarkable people who are featured in what we call our Getting Word Oral History Project. And for some 28 years now, our historians have collected the oral histories of the descendants of the enslaved, many of whom are right there in California, have done some wonderful things in California. Among those are people who were conductors on the Underground Railroad. You see before us a woman named Anne Elizabeth Isaacs. There was Peter Fawcett, who as a child did not know he was enslaved until he was sold there on the auction block. Um, he came back to Monticello. He eventually gained his freedom. He came back to Monticello as an old man, having spent much of his life in Ohio, where he founded a church. He was a community leader. He had a very successful business. He came back to Monticello because that was one of the last wishes of his life. And he said upon his return that Monticello was heaven, paradise on earth, is what he called it, paradise on earth, because it was his home. That's the other thing we've got to remember. Monticello and plantations were homes, the homes of the enslaved people. There were always more brown, black, tan, beige people at Monticello than there were white people. It was their home. The other person we're seeing here is my favorite descendant, a man named William Monroe Trotter. I kind of conflated descendant and dissenter, because this was a man who was a real voice of activism in the early part of the 20th century. He was born a man of privilege. He had resources that he had inherited from his dad. He was a Harvard graduated at the top of his class. But he was also coming of age during the nadir of race relations. And so he wanted to stand up for his people. He founded a newspaper. He helped found the Niagara Movement, which preceded the NAACP, and he fought to the end of his life by suicide for the rights of his people. So he was a great man, and there's a lot to be learned from him. And there are documentaries and books about him because of this renaissance that's occurring now in Black literature, art, and learning about our American history. We can go to the next slide, please. There are also very accomplished women among the descendants, among them Coralie Cook Franklin. She was a renowned campaigner for women's rights. And there's also artist and musician Pauline Powell Burns, who in 1890 became the first Black woman to exhibit art in California. And there's Peggy Priestley. She's a great niece of William Monroe Trotter. She's a civil rights activist. She was a civil rights activist, a freedom writer, and she continues her activism today. And Peggy Priestley also lives right there in California. And if you're interested in learning more about the enslaved and the descendants of the enslaved, you can always go to monticello.org, put Getting Word in the search engine, and learn so much about the remarkable people who come from the families that were enslaved there. And if we could go to the next slide, please. These stories are very complicated and they are often painful, but they are also our history. Monticello is at the center of this history, and we are committed to sharing an inclusive representation of who we are, all of us as a nation. There's so much more, and it's so complex, and it's so illuminating, and it helps to heal. So I encourage you to please visit monticello.org. And when the exhibition becomes available, please do tour. And when it's safe to travel, come on east and visit. It's nice. We'd love to see you. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And I am going to go to, I'm going to go to see what's in the chat to see if I can answer any of your questions. Let's see. And there are quite a few questions here. Let's see. Are there any portraits of Sally Hemings? No, there are no portraits of Sally Hemings. And there are no portraits of Jefferson's wife, and Sally Hemings and Jefferson's wife, Martha Wales Skelton, were half sisters. Jefferson destroyed all the letters between him and his wife, and we don't know if Sally Hemings wrote any letters or if she was even literate. We do know that she spoke a little French and that she spoke often of her years in Paris, but There are no pictures of her. And how do we know Thomas Jefferson's daughter Martha treated the, how do we know? Well, so that's such a good question. Um, Here's what we know. There is a memoir from the youngest son, his name was Madison, of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And in that memoir, he says that his father, Jefferson, never treated him any differently than he did anybody else. He never got special attention. He was very attentive to his grandchildren, but not to his own children. And we do know that Sally Hemings negotiated, when she was in Paris, freedom for their unborn children if she returned to the States with Jefferson. I'm going to back up a little bit. Sally Hemings and her brother James, who was also in Paris, would have been free had they stayed in Europe, in France. But Jefferson had started this relationship with Hemings while they were in Paris, according to the memoir of her son. And he wanted her to return to the States when his ministership was over. And she demurred, she pushed back. She practiced her own agency for that brief moment in time. And she said to him, and Jefferson was in his 40s at this time, and she was 16, and he was very influential. And she said to this older, very influential man, I will come back with you, but only if you free our children and grant me certain privileges. And he agreed to do that. Nothing's in writing. He owned her. When she got back to America, he didn't have to honor this obligation. But upon the 21st birthdays of the 4 children who survived into adulthood, those children were either allowed to walk away from the plantation or they were freed among the handful of people Jefferson freed in his will. As for Sally Hemings, she would have gone to Jefferson's son-in-law because that was what the laws stipulated at that time. However, Jefferson's daughter honored the family's obligation to Sally Hemings, and she was given her time. She was given her time. That meant that she was allowed to live as a free woman. So how did Martha Jefferson treat Sally Hemings? We can't know, but we do know that she did honor her father's promise, and Sally Hemings was given her time. Now, I do want to add this. Martha Jefferson Randolph, was my 4 times great-grandmother. She owned Sally Hemings Robinson, who became my great-great-grandmother. And they were cousins. It's complicated. They were cousins. And Sally Hemings Robinson, this is the niece of the famous Sally Hemings, was a little girl, enslaved person in Washington, D.C., who was accused of stealing slippers and stockings. She gave the stockings to another enslaved girl, and she hid the slippers under the table. Martha Jefferson Randolph was infuriated and sent this child, who was maybe 11 years old, my great-great-grandmother, to be whipped by the constable in Washington, D.C. When the child refused to cooperate, Martha Jefferson Randolph took this child to the basement of their home, where she was held down by another woman, and she whipped her herself. She whipped her herself. She whipped a child. So my 4 times great-grandmother whipped my great-great-grandmother. So I don't think that well of Martha Jefferson Randolph, in spite of the way she adored her father, so she honored her father's wishes, but that was a wicked thing to do. So, thank you for listening. What made me decide to become the community engagement officer? So I spent my entire life, since I was 13 years old, and I am in my early 60s. Oh, it hurts to say that. So I spent years trying to determine how we were related to Thomas Jefferson. And that, in order for me to do that, the best place for me to do it was Monticello. And the best place for me to give voice to the family that I found once I did proved that I was descended to Thomas Jefferson. The family that I found, the family that I feel is mine, the family I feel closest to, the enslaved people of Monticello, I felt compelled to give voice to them because they didn't have a voice. They couldn't speak for themselves. They couldn't say who they are or who they were, but I can. So I'm in a position to speak for them, to share their stories, to breathe life into them, to give them their humanity. And I get paid for it. So it could be better than that. So that's why I'm at Monticello. Um, I think that I think that covers it all, and we have about reached the end of our program. So I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. This was really, it was a great way to spend my Friday evening, and I hope it was a good way for you to spend yours. And I want to thank Diane Walker for putting this together. It was just terrific. And Stephanie Dahl for doing such a great job keeping up with that, with the slideshow. And Kevin for all of your technical ability. And Shauna Redmond for recording this. Kevin Collins, I should say. So many people involved, the Hastings Branch Associates, the Pasadena Library. I got to thank my sister, Dr. Patricia Jessup Woodland, for helping arrange this. And I would like to remind you of the name of the book. It's called
Yes.
Reclamation. Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a daughter's search for her family's lasting legacy, published by HarperCollins, November 16th, 2021. So there we go. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank Gail for sharing with us this evening her amazing journey. I hope that we are all inspired by this, and I hope that we'll be inspired and try to begin our journey and what that may look like for each of us. I want to thank each and every one of you for spending part of your evening with us here at Pasadena Public Library. And I know that we will be getting the book soon as it comes. So I look forward to having a copy, and we will have it, I'm sure, here as well. Thank you again, Gail, and thank you. If nothing else, it's 2 minutes to 6, so we'll leave. Thank you. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye.